My name is Ethan, 33 years old, and working as a financial auditor in Chicago. Today, my older brother Harrison and his wife Naomi drove their brand new Porsche to a rotting foreclosed property I just bought at a tax auction in Gary, Indiana. They threw my $36 receipt at my chest, laughing and calling me a pathetic zero vision failure who buys toxic waste dumps. I just folded the receipt into my pocket and let them drive away. What they did not know was that behind the water-damaged drywall of that exact house sat a hidden steel room containing $18 million of their embezzled corporate cash, and I was about to claim every single cent of it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our family, Harrison was the undisputed golden child, while I was just the spare part. 10 years ago, when I was preparing to start college, our parents had completely drained my dedicated college trust fund. Every single dollar my grandparents had set aside for my education was handed over to Harrison to seed his first tech startup. They did not ask me, they simply took it, claiming Harrison's brilliant ideas were a better investment than my mundane accounting degree. While Harrison was popping champagne at launch parties and playing the brilliant young CEO, I was clawing my way through night school. I worked double shifts checking inventory at a freezing warehouse just to pay for my textbooks and rent. I built my career from absolute zero, while Harrison paraded around, taking all the glory on a foundation of my stolen future. That resentment hung thick in the air today as I stood in the living room of the decaying property. The floorboards were soft with rot and the air smelled heavily of mildew. A crumpled piece of paper suddenly hit me squarely in the chest, fluttering down to rest on my dust-covered boots. It was my auction receipt. $36. You actually paid money for this toxic waste dump, Harrison sneered. He stood in the broken doorway, his bespoke tailored suit looking absurdly out of place. At 36, he was a managing director at an investment firm, arrogant and utterly ruthless. Behind him, stepping delicately over shattered plaster, was his wife Naomi. Naomi was an elite real estate broker, a striking African-American woman who sold multi-million-dollar penthouses and never let anyone forget her status. She pulled a designer scarf over her nose, scanning the ruined room with pure revulsion. "Ethan, this place is a literal biohazard," Naomi gagged, her voice muffled through the expensive fabric. "I have clients who spend more on a single latte than you spent on this entire garbage dump. What exactly is your plan here? Are you going to audit the cockroaches?" Harrison chuckled, kicking a piece of debris toward me. "He probably thinks he is going to flip it. Look at him, Naomi. You should have stayed in your cubicle in Chicago, Ethan. This is pathetic even for you." I did not raise my voice or react to the bait. I picked up my receipt and carefully tucked it away. "It is an investment," I said evenly. "Something I bought with my own money. Which is a novelty in this family, is it not, Harrison?" Harrison's arrogant smile tightened instantly. His jaw clenched and genuine anger replaced his mocking amusement. He knew exactly what I meant. "Oh, please!" Naomi scoffed, dropping her scarf to glare at me with unfiltered disdain. "Are you still crying about that ancient history Harrison needed that capital to build an empire? He multiplied that money tenfold. You would have just wasted it on some mediocre state school degree anyway. Your parents made a strategic investment in the child who actually had potential. It was business, nothing personal." "Strategic?" I repeated the word, tasting like ash. "You mean they robbed their youngest son to coddle their favorite? And look where it got you. You drive a brand new Porsche to a neighborhood you absolutely despise, risking your luxury car in Gary, Indiana, just to mock me for buying a house you think is worthless. It must be exhausting needing to constantly prove how much better you are than the brother you stole from." Harrison took a threatening step forward, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the broken glass. "I do not need to prove anything to you, you ungrateful little accountant. You sit in your tiny apartment crunching other people's numbers because you do not have the guts to make real moves. Mom and Dad were right to cut you off. You have zero vision." Naomi placed a manicured hand on his arm, feigning sympathy laced with pure malice. Leave him be, Harrison. If he wants to play with power tools in a biohazard zone, let him. We have a reservation at a Michelin star restaurant in an hour. We should not breathe in any more of his poverty. I stood my ground, my hands resting loosely at my sides. Enjoy your dinner, I told them, my voice completely devoid of the hurt they were desperately trying to inflict. Be sure to toast to my zero vision, Harrison scoffed, turning on his heel. Do not call us when the roof caves in on you. We are not bailing you out. He guided Naomi out the door, her heels clicking rapidly as she hurried away from the property. I watched through the shattered front window as they climbed back into their gleaming silver Porsche. The engine roared to life, perfectly matching my brother's obnoxious personality. They sped off down the cracked street, leaving me alone in the silent, rotting house. I let out a slow, steady breath. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully put me in my place, reminding me of my position at the bottom of the family hierarchy. But they were entirely wrong. I turned away from the window and looked at the far wall of the living room. It was covered in cheap, water-damaged drywall that had been hastily installed decades ago. My auditor's eye had noticed the discrepancy the moment I walked in. The dimensions of the interior did not match the exterior footprint of the house. There was a gap of about 4 feet that was completely unaccounted for in the county floor plans. I walked over to the corner where I had dropped my tools. I picked up a heavy sledgehammer, the polished wooden handle familiar and solid in my grip. I did not buy this house because I wanted to flip it, and I certainly did not buy it to live in it. I bought it because I knew something they did not. I approached the water-damaged wall, squared my shoulders, and swung the sledgehammer with all my strength. The drywall exploded inward with a satisfying crunch, sending a cloud of white dust and decades-old debris into the air. I swung again, tearing a massive hole in the false partition. Behind the crumbling plaster and rotting wooden studs, there was no plumbing. There was no insulation. Instead, my sledgehammer clanged loudly against cold, solid metal. The vibration from the impact traveled up my arms. Through the jagged hole I had just created, the dull gleam of industrial steel peeked out. Before I could clear the rest of the wood, the unmistakable crunch of heavy tires on broken asphalt echoed outside. I lowered the hammer and turned toward the shattered front window. A pristine black Range Rover had parked exactly where Harrison and Naomi had been idling minutes earlier. The doors opened, and out stepped my parents, Richard and Patricia. They looked like they had just walked off the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Richard wore a tailored charcoal overcoat. Patricia was wrapped in a cashmere trench coat, her expensive leather boots navigating the cracked pavement with caution. They did not look like parents coming to support their son. They looked like health inspectors visiting a contaminated quarantine zone. Harrison had undoubtedly called them from his car, eager to report my supposedly pathetic living conditions. Richard pushed the front door open with his umbrella, refusing to touch the rusted handle. He stepped into the living room, scanning the peeling linoleum floor. Disgust radiated from his every movement. Patricia followed closely behind him, clutching a designer handbag against her chest. Neither of them offered a greeting. There was no warm embrace or simple hello. They simply stared at me as if I were a stranger who had deeply offended them by existing. "Your brother said you had lost your mind," Richard began, his voice booming. "I thought he was exaggerating, but seeing you stand in this squalor, covered in dirt, swinging a hammer like a common laborer, I realized he was being generous. Ethan, this is a complete embarrassment. You are 33 years old. You work a pathetic dead-end job analyzing complicated spreadsheets for people who actually make real money. Are you actively trying to humiliate the family name?" I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection that used to paralyze me. My mind operated like a ledger, cold and precise. I categorized his defensive posture as irrelevant data. "I bought an asset for $36, I replied evenly. "I am simply assessing its structural integrity. You drove all the way from the North Shore just to critique my weekend plans." Patricia stepped forward. "We came here to protect ourselves." She took in my dusty work boots and faded flannel shirt. "Our highly exclusive 40th wedding anniversary gala is scheduled for next weekend. We have over 200 guests attending, including city officials, corporate partners, and international investors. People who expect a certain standard of excellence from our family. She tilted her chin up slightly to look down her nose at me. I am officially revoking your invitation. You are not to attend the gala. Your pathetic, poor auditor aesthetic is completely unacceptable. You refuse to network, and your overall presence is a dark cloud. I will not have you standing in the corner of the ballroom in a cheap suit answering questions about your miserable little life while Harrison and Naomi are securing multi-million-dollar contracts. You would embarrass us, and I simply will not allow it. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the loose window panes. Any normal son would have felt crushed by his own mother, casually erasing him from a milestone family event. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional detachment was my greatest strength. She wanted me to beg. She wanted me to apologize and promise to do better. She wanted the power trip of breaking my spirit. I gave her nothing. I understand completely, I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. You need a flawless aesthetic for your corporate partners. My presence would disrupt that narrative. I accept your decision, Patricia. I will not attend the anniversary gala. I hope you and Richard have a highly successful evening. My absolute lack of resistance caught them off guard. Patricia blinked, her mouth tightening into a thin line. My cold logic robbed her of that satisfaction. Richard scowled, clearly irritated by my composure. You have always been cold, Ethan, he muttered. No ambition, no drive, and absolutely no family loyalty. You are perfectly suited for this rotting house. Enjoy your squalor. Without another word, Richard turned around and marched right out the door. Patricia lingered for a fraction of a second, her gaze sweeping over the dusty floorboards before she followed her husband. I stood completely still and watched them walk back to their Range Rover. The luxury SUV accelerated away from the curb, leaving behind a thick cloud of gray exhaust that slowly drifted across the broken sidewalk. I waited until the sound of their engine completely faded away. Then I walked over to the front door, pushed it shut, and engaged the heavy deadbolt. The toxic distractions were finally gone. I picked up the sledgehammer. I raised the heavy tool and began to swing. Again and again, I smashed away the rotting drywall and splintered wooden studs. Chunks of plaster rained down around my boots as I systematically cleared the false partition. After 10 long minutes of intense physical labor, the entire structure was finally exposed. I dropped the sledgehammer and stepped forward to examine my discovery. It was a heavy, reinforced steel door, completely hidden within the framing of the house. The metal was cold to the touch, secured by a heavy-duty commercial-grade locking mechanism, entirely out of place in a $36 foreclosed property. There were no visible hinges, indicating it was installed to withstand a serious breach. I brushed a layer of chalky white dust off the digital keypad integrated into the steel panel. My family thought I was a pathetic failure digging through trash, but my auditor instincts told me a very different story. Someone had gone to extreme lengths and immense expense to conceal this room from the world, and I was exactly one locked door away from uncovering the truth. I stepped back from the steel panel, my mind rapidly calculating the structural variables. A digital keypad meant internal locking mechanisms, likely heavy steel deadbolts, shooting directly into a reinforced door frame. Kicking it or using a standard hammer would be a complete waste of energy. I needed specialized equipment. I walked out to my truck parked on the cracked driveway and opened the heavy metal toolbox secured in the bed. I pulled out a heavy-duty crowbar, a pair of thick leather work gloves, and my industrial angle grinder along with several reinforced cutting discs. I carried the equipment back into the rotting living room, the floorboards groaning under my boots. I ran a heavy extension cord from the portable generator I had set up earlier on the porch. I plugged in the angle grinder, secured my safety goggles, and flipped the power switch. The tool roared to life with a deafening, high-pitched scream that echoed through the empty neighborhood. I pressed the spinning, abrasive disc against the steel doorframe, aiming precisely where my auditor instincts told me the internal locking bolts would be housed. A massive shower of bright orange sparks erupted into the dim room, illuminating the floating plaster dust. I held the grinder steady, applying relentless pressure as the blade bit deep into the hardened metal. The smell of burning steel and ozone filled the confined space. It took 20 minutes of continuous grueling work to cut through the primary locking pins. I swapped out a worn cutting disc for a fresh one and moved to the heavy hinges concealed behind a steel lip. Another 10 minutes of screaming metal and flying sparks finally weakened the structural integrity of the door. I killed the power to the grinder and picked up the heavy iron crowbar. I wedged the flattened edge of the bar deep into the glowing hot crevice I had just carved out. I braced my boots against the solid wooden studs and threw my entire body weight backward. The rusted steel shrieked in protest. I repositioned the crowbar, finding better leverage, and pulled again with every ounce of strength I possessed. A loud metallic snap echoed through the house as the final internal deadbolt gave way. The heavy steel door groaned as it swung outward on its damaged hinges, revealing a pitch-black void. A rush of stale, perfectly dry air washed over my face. It did not carry the damp, moldy stench of the rotting house behind me. It smelled synthetic metallic and completely preserved. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my high-powered tactical flashlight, clicking the beam onto its highest setting. I stepped over the threshold and crossed into the hidden space. The air temperature dropped noticeably. I swept the harsh white beam of my flashlight across the wall, ceiling, and floor. My auditor brain immediately processed the construction materials. The walls were not standard drywall or concrete. They were paneled with thick, dull gray sheets of solid lead. The floor was poured reinforced concrete elevated slightly above the foundation of the main house to prevent any moisture seepage. I was standing inside a custom-built, hermetically sealed, lead-lined panic room. The dimensions were roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, a perfect rectangle hidden completely off the official county grid. Someone had spent a small fortune constructing a subterranean vault inside a house that looked like it was ready to collapse from the outside. The insulation was absolute, designed to block moisture, thermal imaging, and any electronic signals. I lowered the beam of my flashlight from the lead walls to the center of the room. Sitting squarely on the concrete floor were 3 standard wooden shipping pallets. My breath caught in my throat. Stacked meticulously on top of those wooden pallets were hundreds of transparent, heavy-duty plastic bags. They were vacuum-sealed to perfection, pressing tightly against their contents to eliminate any air or moisture. Inside each sealed bag were perfectly uniform brick like stacks of United States currency. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight reflecting off the glossy plastic. They were all crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. The stacks were banded with distinct bank straps. My professional training took over, instantly shifting my mind into rapid calculation mode. I counted the number of banded bundles within a single vacuum-sealed brick. $10,000 per bundle, 10 bundles per brick, making each plastic-wrapped block worth exactly $100,000. I stepped around the pallets, counting the columns and rows with cold, mechanical precision. My eyes scanned the vertical stacks, multiplying the layers. The math was undeniable. There were exactly 180 bricks secured on those pallets. I was standing in a rotting, foreclosed house in Gary, Indiana, staring directly at exactly $18 million in untraceable cash. I stood frozen for a long moment, letting the sheer magnitude of the discovery settle into my analytical mind. This was not a random drug stash or a forgotten lottery payout. The precision, the custom lead-lined room, the digital keypad, the exact mathematical stacking of the bills. This was a highly calculated, deliberate financial maneuver. I stepped toward the center pallet to examine the nearest brick of cash. That is when I saw it. Resting perfectly flat on top of the highest stack of $100 bills was a thick, cream-colored envelope. I shone my flashlight directly onto the paper. It was secured shut with a heavy puddle of dark red wax pressed with a distinct, familiar seal. A surge of genuine emotion finally broke through my cold auditor exterior. The seal was a vintage brass stamp of a roaring bear. I knew that stamp. I moved my flashlight to illuminate the front of the envelope. Written in sharp, meticulously angled black ink was a single word. My name. Ethan. My heart hammered against my ribs. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to Theodore, my late grandfather. He was the founder of the family empire, a brilliant, tough man, and the absolute only member of my family who had ever shown me genuine love or respect. My parents and Harrison had always dismissed me, but grandfather Theodore had always told me my sharp analytical mind was my greatest asset. He had died 3 years ago, leaving the family company in the greedy hands of my father and brother. I reached out with a trembling, dust-covered glove and picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy and expensive. I broke the red wax seal, the brittle material snapping loudly in the silent vault. I reached inside and pulled out the contents. The first item was a small, encrypted black flash drive. The second item was a single sheet of heavy cardstock paper folded neatly in half. I opened the paper and aimed my flashlight at the center of the page. There was no lengthy explanation, no emotional goodbye, and no list of instructions. Written in my grandfather's unmistakable aggressive handwriting was a single powerful word: checkmate. I stared at the heavy cardstock paper, the single word echoing in my mind like a gunshot. Checkmate. I carefully folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope, along with the encrypted flash drive. I tucked the envelope securely into my interior jacket pocket. My auditor training dictated my next moves with absolute precision. I did not touch a single stack of the $100 bills. I stepped out of the lead-lined panic room, pulled the heavy steel door shut, and engaged the damaged locking mechanism as best as I could. I stacked the broken chunks of drywall and splintered wood back into the frame, creating a makeshift barrier that would obscure the steel door from a casual glance. I gathered my tools, locked the front door of the rotting house, and walked back to my truck. The drive from Gary, Indiana, back to my modest apartment in Chicago took exactly 47 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in complete silence, my mind cataloging the variables of what I had just uncovered. My apartment was a stark contrast to the luxurious estates my family occupied. It was a functional, minimalist one-bedroom unit in a massive concrete high-rise. There was no designer furniture and no expensive art on the walls. It was a space designed for efficiency. I walked straight to my home office setup, dropping my keys on the desk. I pulled my encrypted work laptop from my leather briefcase and powered it up. I bypassed the dual authentication protocols and stared at the blank desktop screen. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the black flash drive, and plugged it into the secure port. A password prompt instantly flashed on the screen. The encryption software was military grade. Anyone else in my family would have been locked out permanently, but my grandfather and I shared the same analytical brain. We thought in patterns and numbers. I typed in the exact date my grandfather had founded his original company, followed by the coordinates of the first warehouse he ever purchased. The progress bar turned green. The drive decrypted instantly. 2 files appeared on my screen. The first was a massive spreadsheet labeled with a sequence of financial codes. The second was a single audio file. I clicked the audio file first. The room filled with the unmistakable gravelly voice of my grandfather Theodore. "If you are listening to this, Ethan, it means my automated protocols worked and you found the vault." My grandfather's voice boomed through the speakers, steady and sharp. "It also means I am dead, and your father and brother think they have won. They think they successfully dismantled my life's work. They are wrong. And you, my boy, are going to be the instrument of their absolute destruction." I leaned back in my chair, hanging on to every word. 3 years ago, I noticed discrepancies in the corporate ledgers, Theodore continued. Small anomalies at first, missing capital, unexplained overseas transfers. I initiated a shadow audit. What I found sickened me. Richard and Harrison were not just making bad investments, they were actively embezzling from the company. They were siphoning the liquid cash reserves and draining the employee retirement funds. They set up offshore shell companies to hide the capital, entirely evading the IRS. Their ultimate goal was to artificially bankrupt the company while I was still at the helm, forcing me to step down in disgrace. They wanted to strip my legacy, buy the liquidated assets for pennies, and rebuild the empire completely under their control without having to wait for me to die. My jaw clenched. I knew my father and brother were arrogant, but the sheer scale of this financial treason was staggering. They were willing to destroy hundreds of innocent employees' retirements just to accelerate their own power grab. I could have handed them over to the federal authorities right then, my grandfather's voice echoed. But doing so would have frozen the company assets for decades in litigation. The employees would have lost everything anyway. So I decided to play their game, but I played it better. Over the course of 14 months, I silently countered their embezzlement. Before they could transfer the funds offshore, I intercepted the capital. I liquidated $18 million of the stolen assets and converted it entirely into untraceable physical cash. I stared at the spreadsheet file on my screen. It was the master ledger. My grandfather had documented every single stolen cent, tracking exactly how Richard and Harrison had tried to hide it, and exactly how he had intercepted it. I needed a secure location, Theodore explained. A place they would never look. Your father and brother despise the working class. They are blinded by their elite snobbery. They view cities like Gary, Indiana as infected wastelands. So I bought an abandoned house through a dummy corporation. I hired a specialized contractor from out of state to build a lead-lined vault hidden within the structural framing. I stacked the $18 million inside. Then I dissolved the dummy corporation and intentionally stopped paying the property taxes. The sheer brilliance of the maneuver hit me. I let the county seize the property for delinquent taxes. My grandfather said, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. I set up a dead man's switch on my private email server. 3 years after my death, it would send an automated tip to your private accounting address, notifying you of a tax deed auction for a property starting at exactly $36. I knew your auditor instincts would compel you to investigate the anomaly. I knew you would buy it. And I knew Richard and Harrison would never set foot in that neighborhood unless they were forced. The audio file was nearing its end. My grandfather's voice softened just a fraction. You have always been the sharpest mind in this family, Ethan. They threw you away because they were terrified of your potential. Now you have the ledger proving their federal tax evasion and corporate embezzlement. You hold the $18 million in physical evidence. The board is set. The pieces are exactly where they need to be. It is your move, Ethan. Finish the game. The recording stopped. The silence in my apartment was deafening. I opened the spreadsheet and cross-referenced the data with the public financial filings of Harrison's current investment firm. My eyes scanned the rows of numbers moving with lightning speed. The financial gap was glaringly obvious to a trained auditor. Harrison and Richard had built their new luxury empire on a massive deficit, assuming they would eventually recover the missing funds my grandfather had intercepted. I checked the corporate tax calendar. Harrison's firm was legally mandated to undergo a comprehensive IRS audit in exactly 4 weeks. They were short exactly $18 million in liquid capital to pass the federal stress test. Without that money, their entire house of cards would collapse, resulting in immediate federal indictments. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the darkness of my office. My family had spent my entire life treating me like a worthless piece of trash. They had stolen my future to fund their greed. Now they were standing on a financial landmine, completely unaware that I was the one holding the detonator. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly focused. I was an auditor, and it was time to balance the books. Any ordinary person finding $18 million in untraceable cash would have lost their mind. They would have stuffed their pockets, booked a one-way ticket to a tropical island, and started buying luxury cars and designer watches. That is exactly how criminals get caught. Sudden influxes of unexplained wealth immediately trigger highly sensitive automatic red flags within the global banking system and the Internal Revenue Service. Furthermore, spending a single dollar of that money would instantly implicate me in my family's federal crimes. If I touched a single bill of that cash, I would instantly transform from an innocent bystander into a fully complicit active participant in massive corporate embezzlement and federal tax evasion. I would be handing my corrupt father and older brother the absolute perfect scapegoat. They would spin a narrative that I was the mastermind, that the disgruntled, estranged son had stolen the family fortune to fund a lavish lifestyle. I was an auditor. I dealt in facts, liability, and risk mitigation. I viewed the towering stacks of $100 bills not as wealth, but as highly radioactive toxic waste. My grandfather had not left me an inheritance to spend. He had left me the ultimate piece of physical evidence. My job was not to spend the money. My job was to use it as bait. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was back on the road to Gary, Indiana. My truck was loaded with thousands of dollars in high-end military-grade surveillance equipment. I had spent the early hours of the morning draining my legitimate personal savings account to purchase the gear. I parked a block away from the foreclosed property to avoid drawing any attention from the neighbors. I carried the heavy equipment boxes through the broken front door and immediately got to work. I did not even look at the steel door hidden behind the crumbling drywall. The cash inside the vault was irrelevant to my current operational parameters. My sole focus was securing the perimeter. I spent 7 straight hours wiring concealed high-definition night vision capable cameras into the structural framework of the house. I positioned one camera directly above the false wall angled downward to capture anyone attempting to breach the hidden room. 2 more cameras were embedded in the rotting ceiling joists of the living room, covering all points of entry. The exterior was blanketed with motion-activated sensors disguised as debris. I connected the entire network to a heavy-duty battery-backed cellular router hidden in the crawl space. Every single camera fed a continuous encrypted live stream directly to a secure server I hosted in my Chicago apartment. If a mouse crawled across the floorboards of that house, my phone would instantly alert me. Once the physical security was absolute, I handled the legal barriers. Sitting in the dusty living room on an overturned bucket, I opened my laptop and tethered it to my cellular hotspot. I registered a new blind trust online acting as the sole trustee. I legally transferred the title of the $36 property into the trust. This meant my name was officially wiped from the immediate public county records, creating a bureaucratic maze for anyone trying to quickly determine the owner. Next, I contacted a specialized commercial insurance broker. I purchased an ironclad heavy-duty liability and property insurance policy for the structure. I did not insure the $18 million inside. I insured the physical building itself against unauthorized entry, structural damage, and vandalism. Everything was now strictly by the book. The trap was set legally fortified and under 24-hour surveillance. I locked the property and drove back to Chicago. It was time to finalize the financial timeline. I sat at my desk and pulled up the most recent public corporate filings for Harrison's investment firm. Operating as an executive director, my brother had recently filed mandatory disclosures with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding a massive new real estate acquisition fund. I placed my grandfather's decoded ledger on my left monitor and Harrison's public filings on my right. I began to cross-reference the data streams. The numbers told a story of absolute sheer panic. Harrison and my father had over-leveraged their new firm to an astronomical degree. They had committed capital they did not actually possess, relying entirely on the assumption that they would quietly retrieve the stolen $18 million to cover their massive liabilities. They had cooked their current books to reflect phantom assets, creating a massive liquidity gap. I dug deeper into the federal tax calendar. My eyes locked onto a highly specific filing deadline. Due to the massive scale of their new acquisitions, their firm had triggered an automatic, mandatory, comprehensive audit by the Internal Revenue Service. The federal agents were scheduled to begin their forensic review of Harrison's accounts in exactly 4 weeks. It was a ticking time bomb. The IRS does not overlook phantom assets. When the federal auditors demanded to see the physical proof of their liquid capital, Harrison and my father would be short exactly $18 million. The exact amount of cash sitting in a lead-lined vault in Gary, Indiana. They were legally and financially trapped. Without that specific cash injection, the IRS would instantly detect the embezzlement, triggering a cascade of federal indictments for bank fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. My brother and my father were staring down the barrel of decades in federal prison, and the deadline was rapidly approaching. I closed my laptop, a sense of cold satisfaction settling over me. The board was perfectly aligned. The pressure on my family was about to reach a breaking point, and their staggering arrogance would completely blind them to the looming danger. They believed they were untouchable financial titans, completely immune to consequences. They were entirely wrong. The countdown had officially begun, and I was completely ready to watch their entire empire burn to the ground under the weight of their own greed. Tuesday morning arrived with biting Chicago wind. I was downtown in the financial district picking up my usual black coffee from a high-end artisan roastery located in the lobby of a towering glass skyscraper. It was a place where investment bankers and corporate lawyers gathered to perform their wealth. I only went there because it was directly across the street from my auditing firm. I stood near the espresso bar, holding my battered leather briefcase, mentally reviewing the timeline for the IRS audit hitting my brother's firm. That was when I heard her voice, loud, abrasive, and completely unconcerned with anyone else in the room. "Harrison, make sure they use oat milk this time. The dairy yesterday was absolutely unacceptable." Naomi pushed her way to the front of the pickup counter, cutting off two junior analysts. Harrison was right behind her, wearing a navy pinstripe suit that cost more than my first car. He was aggressively typing on his phone, his jaw tight. They were exactly 30 feet away from my office building, firmly in their element, radiating undeserved superiority. I could have easily turned around and walked out the side exit to avoid the confrontation. I chose to stay. I wanted to look my brother in the eye. I wanted to see the exact state of his nervous system. I stepped up to the counter to grab my order. Naomi turned around, her designer handbag swinging wildly, and nearly collided with my chest. She gasped, taking a dramatic step back, as if she had just bumped into a diseased animal. Her eyes scanned my face, then dropped down to my scuffed leather briefcase. A wicked, highly polished smile spread across her face. "Ethan," she announced, making sure her voice carried to the surrounding tables. "I see you are still haunting the financial district. I assumed after buying that biohazard dump in Indiana, you would have relocated to a cardboard box by now." Harrison looked up from his phone. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. He slipped his phone into his jacket pocket and stepped up next to his wife, presenting a united front of extreme wealth. "What are you doing here, Ethan? Trying to network with people who actually matter. You should know by now that nobody in this building is looking to hire a low-tier spreadsheet checker. You are completely out of your depth." Naomi laughed, a sharp, ringing sound. She gestured toward my briefcase with a perfectly manicured finger. "Look at that bag, Harrison. The leather is literally peeling. It is genuinely embarrassing. But I suppose when you have zero ambition, you do not need to carry anything important. You should see the custom Italian leather portfolio Harrison just bought. Of course, when you are about to close a massive Series C funding round, you have to dress for the valuation. We are bringing in $50 million in fresh capital next month. What are you bringing in, Ethan? Coupons?" I did not flinch. I did not defend my briefcase or my career. My auditor training kicked in, allowing me to scan Harrison with clinical precision. Despite his aggressive posturing, I noticed the micro-expressions of extreme stress, the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the tight, irregular pattern of his breathing, the dark circles hidden beneath a fresh layer of expensive skin cream. He was projecting extreme power, but his biological responses screamed sheer panic. He was a man standing on a trapdoor waiting for the floor to drop. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I looked directly past Naomi, completely ignoring her existence, and locked my gaze onto Harrison's eyes. "A Series C funding round," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and perfectly level. "That is an aggressive move, Harrison, especially considering the current architecture of your balance sheets. Scaling up with $50 million in venture capital is a massive commitment. It requires absolute flawless transparency." Harrison scoffed, puffing out his chest. "We have flawless transparency. My firm is an industry leader. We are managing portfolios that you cannot even comprehend." "I comprehend the math perfectly," I replied, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal register. I also comprehend the extreme danger of phantom assets. You see, Harrison venture capitalists are aggressive, but the federal government is meticulous. When an investment firm expands that rapidly, it triggers automatic federal oversight. It is standard protocol. I imagine you are preparing for a comprehensive review, the kind where federal agents demand to see the physical verification of all liquid capital reserves. I took a step closer to my brother. I did not break eye contact. I was looking over some market trends recently. It is fascinating how easily a firm can project massive growth while secretly suffering from a catastrophic liquidity gap. A gap of, say, exactly $18 million. A gap that cannot be filled by shifting numbers on a spreadsheet. When the IRS initiates their mandatory audit next month, they do not look at projections. They look at the vault. I sincerely hope your vault is full, Harrison, because covering an $18 million liquidity gap in 4 weeks requires a miracle or a very fast plane out of federal jurisdiction. The bustling noise of the coffee shop seemed to fade into a dull hum. Financial analysts and brokers rushed past us, completely unaware of the devastating confrontation happening by the espresso bar. The smug arrogance completely vanished from Harrison's face. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and gray. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. The psychological impact of my words hit him like a physical blow to the chest. I had just casually recited the exact highly classified details of his federal tax evasion and the precise dollar amount he had embezzled. I had just told him that I knew his execution date. Naomi, completely oblivious to the financial realities of her husband's crimes, crossed her arms impatiently. She tapped her expensive stiletto against the polished tile floor. She was a woman who demanded immediate compliance and adoration, and my blatant disrespect offended her core sensibilities. What nonsense are you rambling about now, Ethan? Are you trying to sound smart using vocabulary words you read in a textbook? Harrison's vault is perfectly fine. Tell him, Harrison. Tell him how pathetic he sounds. Harrison did not speak. He could not speak. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He looked physically ill. A bead of sweat rolled down his pale temple. His hands began to tremble at his sides. He glared at Naomi, desperate for her to stop talking, but he was too paralyzed by fear to form a coherent sentence. He knew I had the ledger. He knew I possessed the exact numbers that could destroy him. I gave him a slow, knowing smile. I adjusted my grip on my battered leather briefcase and stepped around them toward the exit. I walked away feeling a profound sense of clarity. The psychological warfare had been perfectly executed. I had planted the seed of absolute terror in his mind without making a single direct threat. I did not mention the house in Gary, Indiana. I did not mention our late grandfather Theodore. I simply weaponized the raw financial data and let his own guilt do the heavy lifting. "Enjoy the oat milk, Naomi," I said over my shoulder. "And Harrison, make sure you double-check your math. Federal prison suits do not come tailored." I pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked out into the biting Chicago wind. I left my brother standing frozen in the middle of the crowded coffee shop, sweating profusely, suddenly realizing that the poor auditor he despised held the absolute power to destroy his entire life. The certified letter from the Internal Revenue Service arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered directly to the executive suite of Harrison and Richards investment firm. The heavy cream-colored envelope bore the unmistakable seal of the federal government, commanding immediate attention. The letter was not a routine inquiry or a standard request for documentation. It was formal notification of a comprehensive forensic audit covering the last 3 fiscal years of corporate activity. The IRS was sending a specialized team of federal agents to examine every ledger, verify every transaction, and demand physical proof of all claimed liquid assets. The audit was scheduled to commence in exactly 28 days. The arrival of the letter triggered absolute unmitigated panic within the executive suite. The carefully constructed facade of invincibility shattered instantly. My father Richard, who usually projected an aura of calm corporate authority, paced the length of his expensive corner office like a caged animal. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed the legal summons. Harrison sat slouched in a leather armchair, his arrogant posture completely abandoned. The reality of their situation hit them with the force of a freight train. The phantom assets they had created on paper to cover their embezzlement were about to be scrutinized by federal investigators trained to find financial anomalies. They needed exactly $18 million in physical cash to pass the stress test. Without that money, the audit would expose the massive liquidity gap, leading to immediate federal indictments for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. Decades in federal prison were suddenly a very real, rapidly approaching possibility. Desperation completely overrode their usual sense of superiority. They knew the money existed. They knew my grandfather Theodore had intercepted their stolen funds and liquidated the assets into untraceable cash before his death, but they had never been able to locate the physical cash reserves. In a state of sheer panic, Richard and Harrison drove to a high-security, climate-controlled storage facility on the outskirts of Chicago. The unit contained the remaining physical files, personal documents, and encrypted hard drives that had belonged to my grandfather. They had previously dismissed these items as sentimental junk too arrogant to believe the old man had outsmarted them. Now their freedom depended on finding a single clue hidden within those boxes. They tore through the storage unit with frantic, destructive energy. Expensive designer suits were covered in dust as they ripped open cardboard boxes, dumping decades of corporate history onto the concrete floor. They scoured old tax returns, property deeds, and personal correspondence. They were looking for an anomaly, a hidden bank account, a safety deposit box, anything that could point to the location of the missing $18 million. Hours bled into the night. Exhaustion and fear fueled their frantic search. Just as they were about to abandon hope, Harrison found a small, heavy iron lockbox hidden at the very bottom of a crate, marked with my grandfather's personal seal. He smashed the lock with a hammer, prying the lid open. Inside the lockbox was a single manila folder. It contained a series of seemingly mundane documents: a certified property appraisal, an environmental impact report, a land survey detailing soil composition. All the documents were related to a specific address located in a severely depressed industrial zone in Gary, Indiana. My grandfather had intentionally left this breadcrumb trail. He knew their arrogance would prevent them from looking in the Rust Belt unless they were absolutely desperate. He knew they would eventually find the folder when their crimes finally caught up with them. Harrison grabbed the property deed from the folder. His hands shook as he read the address. It was the exact same property I had purchased at the tax auction just weeks prior, the rotting, toxic waste dump they had ruthlessly mocked me for buying. The realization hit Harrison like a physical blow. The $18 million was not hidden in a Swiss bank account or a luxury high-rise. The money was hidden inside the very house he had stood in, insulting my ambition and zero vision. "The money is in Gary," Harrison gasped, his voice tight with panic. "Theodore hid the cash in that rotting house. That is why he kept all these structural reports. He built a vault." Richard snatched the deed from his son's hands, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That makes no sense. Why would he hide $18 million in a neighborhood like that? And why would he let the property go to a tax deed auction?" "Because he knew we would never look there." Harrison realized the horrifying truth dawning on him. He set a trap. He let the county seize the property, knowing the auction would eventually trigger. Harrison pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he accessed the public county tax records for Gary, Indiana. He typed in the property address, bypassing the initial search parameters to dig into the recent transaction history. He needed to confirm the current legal owner. He needed to know if the county still held the deed or if a random investor had unknowingly purchased a fortune. The database loaded. The screen refreshed, displaying the updated property records. The color completely drained from Harrison's face. He stopped breathing. The name of the new legal owner was displayed in stark black and white text. It was not the county. It was not a random real estate developer. The property and the $18 million hidden inside its walls was legally owned by the blind trust I had established, and the sole trustee listed on the public record was Ethan. "Dad," Harrison whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "Ethan owns the house. He bought it at the auction. Richard stared at the phone screen, his expression shifting from disbelief to absolute horror. The son they had disowned, the poor auditor, they had publicly humiliated the man they had relentlessly mocked just days ago, now legally controlled the exact asset they desperately needed to avoid federal prison. The psychological warfare I had initiated at the coffee shop suddenly made terrifying sense to them. I did not just suspect their crimes, I possessed the physical evidence. The trap had sprung, and they were caught completely off guard. The realization that their fate rested entirely in my hands paralyzed them with fear. The power dynamic had shifted instantly and irrevocably. The paralysis that gripped my father and brother in that storage unit did not last long. For men like Harrison, sheer terror rapidly mutates into reckless, destructive action. Logic dictates that when you are under federal scrutiny, you tread lightly. But desperation completely overrode my brother's basic reasoning. The IRS audit was breathing down his neck. The $18 million was the only thing standing between him and a federal prison cell. In his frantic, arrogant mind, he convinced himself of a highly convenient narrative. He assumed I was just a naive accountant who bought a cheap property on a whim. He rationalized that there was absolutely no way I could have discovered a custom-built concealed vault hidden behind the drywall in just a matter of days. He believed the cash was still sitting there untouched and undetected, waiting for him to claim it. Harrison decided to bypass the legal system entirely. He could not send his corporate lawyers to demand the money without admitting the funds existed and triggering the exact IRS investigation he was trying to avoid. He needed a surgical strike. He needed the cash extracted quietly and immediately. Operating entirely outside his comfortable world of boardrooms and luxury dinners, Harrison ventured into the criminal underbelly. Using untraceable cash, he hired 2 local enforcers. These were not sophisticated professionals. They were heavy-handed thugs, accustomed to kicking down doors and intimidating tenants. Harrison paid them a premium for total discretion and immediate action. The plan was brutally simple. Break into the rotting house in Gary, smash, through the false wall, load the heavy vacuum-sealed bricks of cash into a rented cargo van, and vanish into the night before I ever knew someone had breached my property. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the harsh industrial landscape of Gary, Indiana, was swallowed by thick, oppressive darkness. The streetlights in that particular neighborhood had burned out years ago and were never replaced. A heavy cargo van rolled to a slow stop half a block away from my property. The engine cut off. The door slid open with a muted metallic scrape. 3 figures stepped out into the freezing night air. Harrison led the way, his expensive designer coat swapped for a dark hoodie and a pulled-down baseball cap. He was completely out of his element, shivering from the cold and the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Flanking him were the 2 hired men carrying heavy canvas duffel bags filled with industrial-grade bolt cutters, sledgehammers, and crowbars. They moved quickly across the cracked pavement, their heavy boots crunching softly against the scattered debris. Harrison directed them straight toward the front porch. The rotting wood groaned under their combined weight. One of the men pulled a massive pair of bolt cutters from his bag, stepping up to the heavy deadbolt I had secured just days prior. Harrison stood right behind him, his eyes darting nervously down the empty street. He was sweating profusely despite the biting wind. He was literally minutes away from securing his salvation. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he was executing the perfect midnight raid. 50 miles away in my secure Chicago apartment, I was wide awake. The soft blue glow of my dual monitors illuminated my home office. I was currently running a forensic analysis on a separate corporate account, my mind fully engaged in the numbers. Then my phone illuminated silently on my desk. The screen displayed a stark red banner. A motion sensor alert had just been triggered. I set down my pen and picked up the device. I opened the encrypted security application I had installed. The software instantly connected to the hidden cellular router buried in the crawl space of the Gary property. A crisp, high-definition military-grade night vision feed filled my screen. The visual was absolute perfection. I was looking directly down from the concealed camera mounted above the front porch. The infrared sensors rendered the pitch-black night into a crystal-clear glowing green landscape. I watched the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing rats in a maze. There was my older brother, the untouchable investment director, reduced to a common burglar sneaking around an abandoned porch in the middle of the night. I watched the hired thug raise the heavy bolt cutters, positioning the steel jaws directly over my reinforced deadbolt. I watched Harrison hovering anxiously over his shoulder, completely oblivious to the fact that he was staring directly into a high-definition lens. I did not panic. I did not call the local police. Involving local law enforcement would require explaining the $18 million, which was completely out of the question until my federal whistleblower case was fully prepared. I needed to handle this internal threat personally. I needed to shatter Harrison's psyche so completely that he would never attempt a physical breach again. I waited for the exact right second. I watched the thug tighten his grip on the handles of the bolt cutters. He braced his boots against the doorframe, preparing to snap the lock. I tapped the microphone icon on my screen, activating the two-way audio system. The concealed high-decibel outdoor speakers mounted under the porch eaves crackled to life. I leaned close to my phone, keeping my voice incredibly smooth, completely devoid of any anger or panic. I spoke with the icy precision of an executioner. Looking for 18 million reasons to stay out of federal prison, Harrison. You are trespassing on private property. The sound of my voice blasted through the dead silence of the neighborhood, echoing off the surrounding abandoned houses. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The thug holding the bolt cutters flinched so hard he dropped the heavy metal tool directly onto the wooden deck. The loud clang shattered the quiet night. The two hired men whipped their heads around, scanning the dark porch in absolute terror. They had been paid to break into an empty, forgotten house. They had not signed up for a highly monitored, heavily secured facility equipped with two-way surveillance. The realization that they were being watched by an unseen entity, an entity explicitly mentioning federal prison, triggered their immediate survival instincts. Without saying a single word to Harrison, the two thugs abandoned their duffel bags, jumped off the side of the porch, and sprinted down the street toward their cargo van in sheer panic. Harrison did not run. He could not run. The sound of my voice paralyzing him completely. He stood frozen on the rotting wooden planks, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He stared up at the dark ceiling of the porch, desperately trying to locate the hidden speakers. His breathing was rapid and shallow, visible in the cold night air. The arrogant investment director was entirely broken. He realized in that agonizing moment that I had not just bought a house. I had found the vault. I had found the money. I had secured the perimeter, and I was watching his every single move. The trap had slammed shut and he was standing right in the middle of it. The sun had barely risen over the Chicago skyline when the aggressive rapid-fire knocking echoed through my apartment. I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee, reviewing the recorded security footage from the Gary property. I watched the replay of Harrison fleeing down the broken sidewalk, his expensive sneakers splashing through icy puddles in sheer terror. I closed the laptop. I knew exactly who was on the other side of my front door. Desperation has a very distinct sound, and the pounding against my doorframe reeked of absolute panic. I stood up, walked across the minimalist living room, and checked the peephole. The entire toxic ensemble was gathered in my narrow hallway. My father, Richard, stood at the front, his posture rigid. Beside him, my mother, Patricia, was nervously smoothing the wrinkles of her cashmere coat. Harrison stood toward the back, looking completely ravaged. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, and he refused to look directly at the peephole, clearly traumatized by our late-night intercom exchange. Next to him stood Naomi, her posture impeccably straight, holding a sleek leather document portfolio against her chest. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. They did not wait for an invitation. Richard immediately pushed past me, stepping into my apartment as if he owned the building. Patricia followed, bringing the cloying scent of heavy designer perfume into my quiet space. Naomi and Harrison trailed behind, closing the door. I watched them invade my home with the clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a compromised ledger. They were attempting a coordinated psychological pivot, a complete 180-degree turn from the vicious insults they had hurled at me just 24 hours ago. Patricia initiated the performance. She stepped forward, her eyes brimming with manufactured tears. She reached out and grabbed my forearms, her grip surprisingly tight. "Ethan, my sweet boy," she gasped, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion. "We have been sick with worry. We hardly slept a wink last night. I know we said some incredibly harsh things to you yesterday at that terrible house. We were just so shocked and upset seeing you in those conditions. You have to understand, we only reacted out of pure maternal and paternal concern. We have missed our boy so much." She pulled me into a rigid, suffocating hug. I did not return the embrace. I let my arms hang completely limp at my sides. Her performance was a masterclass in manipulation, completely ignoring the fact that she had gleefully uninvited me from her anniversary gala just one day prior. Richard stepped up next, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Your mother is right, Ethan. I let my temper get the better of me. When I saw you swinging that hammer in a toxic environment, my protective instincts took over. We are a family. We may have our disagreements, but blood is thicker than water. We want to mend the bridge between us. We want to bring you back into the fold." I looked at Harrison. He was staring at the floorboards, completely silent. The arrogant investment director who had mocked my cheap briefcase was entirely subdued. He knew that I knew, but he clearly had not told Richard and Patricia about his disastrous midnight raid. He had kept his criminal failure a secret from the family, letting them believe they could still outsmart me with a simple emotional manipulation tactic. "I appreciate the sudden shift in your perspective," I replied evenly, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Please have a seat at the table. I assume you did not drive all the way from the North Shore at 7 in the morning just to offer me a hug." They moved to the kitchen island. Naomi took charge of the physical space, sliding into the center stool and placing her leather portfolio directly on the countertop. She unzipped the case with practiced fluid motions. The elite real estate broker persona was fully activated. She offered me a bright, completely artificial smile that showcased her flawless teeth. "Ethan, we all want to see you succeed." Naomi began, her tone dripping with corporate smoothness. "We know you have been struggling in this tiny apartment, working a high-stress job for very little reward. When we saw that property you purchased, we realized you were crying out for help. You made a reckless financial decision out of desperation. That house in Gary is not an asset. It is a massive liability. The structural damage, the mold, the foundational rot, it is a money pit that will bankrupt you in property taxes and code violations alone." She reached into the portfolio and pulled out a crisp, professionally bound real estate contract. She slid it across the kitchen island, positioning it exactly in front of my coffee mug. "Because we love you, and because we want to help you out of this financial rut, Richard and Harrison have authorized a family bailout," Naomi explained, tapping a manicured nail against the signature line. "I have drafted a direct purchase agreement. We are offering to buy that worthless, moldy property off your hands today. Right now, we will absorb all the legal liabilities, all the code violations, and all the toxic waste cleanup costs." I looked down at the contract, then back up at Naomi. I did not touch the paper. "And what is the exact figure of this generous family favor?" Naomi leaned forward, her eyes wide with fake excitement. $50,000, Ethan. We are offering you a clean cashier's check for $50,000. You bought that deed for $36. Do you understand the math on that return? It is a once-in-a-lifetime profit margin. You can pay off your debts, upgrade your wardrobe, and maybe even put a down payment on a place in a decent neighborhood. We are handing you a fresh start." The sheer audacity of the pitch was staggering. It was a perfectly crafted insult disguised as a life raft. They honestly believed I was stupid enough to accept a $50,000 bribe in exchange for handing over $18 million in physical cash and the ultimate piece of federal evidence. They were trying to buy their freedom with pocket change, relying on the assumption that my supposed poverty made me desperate and blind to the true value of the asset. I stared at the contract. The printed numbers looked exceptionally pathetic compared to the vacuum-sealed bricks of $100 bills resting inside the lead-lined vault. I slowly lifted my gaze, meeting Naomi's expectant stare. then shifted my eyes to my father, my mother, and finally my terrified brother. They were holding their breath, waiting for the poor auditor to eagerly sign away his leverage. They had absolutely no idea the psychological trap I was about to spring on them. I did not touch the pen. I did not even look down at the meticulously formatted contract Naomi had placed in front of me. Instead, I extended my index finger and pressed it against the center of the document, slowly sliding it back across the smooth surface of the kitchen island until it stopped directly against Naomi's folded hands. The silence in the apartment stretched tight, brittle, and heavy. A generous family favor. I repeated, my voice flat, maintaining absolute eye contact with Naomi before shifting my gaze to Harrison. That is a fascinating pivot. Let me consult my memory of the exact assessment you provided just yesterday. I leaned back on my stool and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The dark roast was bitter, matching the reality I was about to serve them. Yesterday afternoon, I was a pathetic zero-vision failure who buys toxic waste dumps, I recited, keeping my tone entirely conversational. This house was a literal biohazard, a garbage dump bought for the price of a coffee and a croissant. You asked if I was going to audit the cockroaches. You stated firmly that I should have stayed in my cubicle in Chicago because buying that property was pathetic even for me. I turned my attention to Patricia, who was suddenly looking incredibly uncomfortable. Then you both arrived. You declared that my pathetic poor auditor aesthetic was a complete embarrassment. You barred me from your highly exclusive anniversary gala because my overall presence is a dark cloud that would humiliate the family name. You told me I had no ambition, no drive, and absolutely no family loyalty. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter. The ceramic clinked sharply in the quiet room. So, I continued, folding my hands together on the table. Why would a family of such elite status, managing multi-million-dollar portfolios and preparing for a massive Series C funding round, desperately want to purchase my toxic waste dump for $50,000 at 7 in the morning? It seems like a terrible return on investment for people who claim to possess such flawless financial transparency. The fake smiles vanished. The manufactured maternal warmth evaporated instantly from Patricia's face, replaced by a cold, hard glare. Naomi snatched the contract off the counter, her perfectly manicured fingers crinkling the expensive paper. The facade of the loving, concerned family collapsed completely, leaving only the ugly, desperate reality of their true nature. "You smug, ungrateful little bastard!" Naomi spat, her voice dropping its professional cadence and taking on a venomous edge. "We are offering you a way out. Take the money and hand over the deed before you get yourself involved in things you cannot possibly comprehend." "I comprehend perfectly," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "I comprehend that Harrison tried to break into my property at 2 o'clock this morning with bolt cutters and hired thugs. I comprehend that he ran away like a terrified child the second he realized I was watching him on a live security feed." Patricia gasped, turning to stare at Harrison in pure shock. Richard's face twisted in sudden fury. He had clearly not been informed of the failed midnight raid. Harrison shrank back against the wall, looking completely humiliated and exposed. "You went there last night," Richard bellowed, rounding on his eldest son. "You incompetent fool! I told you we handle this legally." Richard spun back to face me, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. He slammed his heavy fist down on the kitchen island. The impact rattled my coffee mug, spilling dark liquid onto the pristine counter. He leaned over the granite surface, towering over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he had done when I was a child. "Listen to me very carefully, Ethan." Richard snarled, the veins in his neck bulging against his expensive collar. "We are done playing games. I know you found the vault. I know you found what Theodore hid behind that wall. You think you have stumbled onto a winning lottery ticket, but you are playing with fire. Those contents do not belong to you. That capital rightfully belongs to the family empire. It is the lifeblood of our company, and I will not let a resentful, mediocre accountant steal my legacy." "Your legacy," I said, tilting my head slightly. "You mean the stolen retirement funds and the embezzled corporate cash reserves. Is that the legacy you are trying to protect, Richard?" It is corporate capital, Richard roared, spittle flying from his lips. It belongs to the firm. Theodore lost his mind at the end. He hid our assets out of spite, trying to ruin what I built. You have absolutely no legal right to it. You are going to sign that property over to me today, or I promise you I will make your life a living nightmare. I picked up my coffee mug, completely unbothered by his screaming. I took another sip, letting the silence stretch out, forcing him to stand there panting with rage. I am not signing anything, I said calmly. The property is legally registered to a blind trust under my name. The perimeter is secured. The cameras are recording. And the asset remains exactly where it is. Richard pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my chest. His eyes were wild with desperation and fury. You have no idea who you are dealing with. You think your little security cameras and your blind trust can stop me. I have an army of the best corporate lawyers in the state of Illinois on retainer. I have partners who can ruin your career with a single phone call. I will drag you into federal court. I will bury you in litigation until you are bankrupt and homeless. I will tie you up in so many legal injunctions that you will be begging me to take that house off your hands. I will crush you, Ethan. I will take that property by force and I will leave you with absolutely nothing. He stood there, chest heaving, expecting me to cower. He expected the threat of overwhelming legal and financial ruin to break my resolve. He thought his wealth and power were the ultimate weapons. I looked at his pointing finger. Then I looked up into his enraged, panicked eyes, and slowly, deliberately, I smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile. A smile of absolute victory. Good, I said softly, my voice cutting through the thick tension in the room. I highly encourage you to do exactly that, Richard. Send your lawyers, file the lawsuits, drag me into federal court, and demand that the asset be returned to you. I look forward to it. Richard stormed out of my apartment, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the walls. The rest of them followed suit, a parade of defeated arrogance retreating into the hallway. I locked the deadbolt behind them, the heavy metallic click signaling the start of a much larger war. They had their marching orders, and I knew precisely how predictable they were. They operated on the fundamental belief that whoever screams the loudest and spends the most money controls the narrative. By Tuesday morning, the assault on my reputation was operating at full capacity. Naomi was a master of high society character assassination, and she unleashed her wealth and influence to destroy my credibility. She leveraged her extensive real estate network to wage a quiet, vicious whisper campaign across Chicago's elite circles. Through the digital grapevine of professional platforms and mutual industry contacts, her fabricated story began to circulate like poison. According to Naomi, the stress of my mediocre auditing career had triggered a severe, irreversible psychological breakdown. I was painted as an unhinged, estranged relative who had become dangerously obsessed with the family finances, squatting in toxic, condemned properties, and making erratic threats against my own blood. She carefully seeded these rumors with just enough fake sympathy to make them believable. People in my professional orbit began giving me strange looks. Valued clients abruptly canceled meetings. My digital footprint was suddenly radioactive, stained by the manufactured narrative of a man losing his grip on reality. Richard did not rely on whispers. He utilized raw corporate leverage. On Wednesday afternoon, I was summoned to the executive suite of my auditing firm. The two senior managing partners were waiting for me, their expressions grim and unreadable. Human resources personnel were seated at the far end of the long mahogany table. They informed me that a highly influential corporate entity had lodged a formal complaint against my professional conduct. Richard had contacted the board directly. He leveraged his massive investment portfolios and threatened to pull his lucrative accounts from our partnered financial institutions if I remained on staff. He presented a fabricated narrative that I was actively attempting to extort my own family, accusing me of severe ethical violations, breaching fiduciary duties, and displaying extreme mental instability that compromised client data. The managing partners were apologetic but entirely pragmatic. In the cutthroat world of corporate auditing, perception is reality, and Richard carried far too much financial weight to ignore. They informed me that my access to all company servers was being revoked immediately. I was officially suspended without pay pending a comprehensive internal investigation. They handed me a small cardboard box and ordered building security to escort me out. To anyone else, the public walk of shame through the bullpen carrying a box of personal items under the watchful eyes of silent colleagues would have been a humiliating, soul-crushing defeat. For me, it was a profound tactical advantage. I walked out of the glass lobby and stepped into the crisp Chicago air. I did not panic about my lost salary or my damaged reputation. The family believed they were completely destroying my foundation, starving me into submission, and isolating me from society. They thought cutting off my income would force me to crawl back to them begging for forgiveness and surrendering the Gary property for that insulting $50,000 check. They were applying textbook corporate warfare tactics against a man who was fighting a federal compliance battle. I returned to my quiet minimalist apartment. My schedule was now entirely clear. The suspension gave me the exact resource I needed most: uninterrupted time. I shut off my personal phone, muting the influx of concerned texts from former colleagues and the aggressive, threatening voicemails from my brother. I booted up my encrypted laptop and fully immersed myself in my grandfather Theodore's data. Over the next 2 weeks, my dining table transformed into a war room. I cross-referenced every single illegal transaction Richard and Harrison had executed. I mapped the flow of the stolen retirement funds through their offshore shell companies directly to the $18 million in physical cash sitting in that lead-lined vault. I operated with clinical precision, acting as a one-man forensic task force. I printed out wire transfer receipts, falsified tax returns, and property deeds. I transcribed key audio logs from Theodore's diaries, linking specific voice recordings to precise dates of embezzlement. I organized the massive volume of evidence into heavy indexed binders, color-coding the financial violations according to specific federal statutes: bank fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, grand larceny. I compiled a bulletproof 500-page whistleblower report. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting detailing the exact anatomy of my family's criminal enterprise. It left absolutely no room for interpretation and provided the federal government with a perfectly packaged, indisputable roadmap to a conviction. While my family toasted to my supposed ruin in their luxury estates, assuming I was breaking under the weight of their smear campaign, I sat in the absolute calm of the storm. I drank my coffee-highlighted federal tax codes and systematically built the cage that would lock them away for decades. The trap was fully loaded. Now I just needed them to walk into a federal courtroom and pull the trigger themselves. The official notification arrived by bonded courier on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my dining table reviewing the final draft of my whistleblower report when the heavy envelope was handed to me. The return address belonged to one of the most ruthless, high-priced corporate litigation firms in Chicago. I signed for the package, closed the door, and tore it open. It was a formal summons to appear in United States federal court. Richard and Harrison had officially filed a lawsuit against me. I read through the preliminary filings, a cold smile touching my lips. They had done exactly what I anticipated. Desperation had forced them to commit their narrative to the legal record. The lawsuit claimed that my grandfather, Theodore, had suffered a severe mental decline in his final years and had unlawfully transferred $18 million of vital corporate cash reserves out of the family firm. They alleged that he had hidden these funds within the structural framing of the Gary, Indiana property. The most damning part of their filing, however, was their explanation of my involvement. Richard's lawyers claimed that Ethan, had utilized my background as an auditor to somehow manipulate the county tax records intentionally, forcing the property into foreclosure so I could purchase it and steal the family's capital. It was an incredibly aggressive, highly fabricated story designed to paint me as a deceitful, opportunistic thief. But the story itself was irrelevant. What mattered was the core legal assertion they had just made. By filing this lawsuit in federal court, Richard and Harrison had officially legally declared that the $18 million hidden inside that lead-lined vault belonged entirely to their firm. They had staked their claim. I flipped to the attached exhibits. My jaw tightened as I reviewed the supplementary documents. Richard had not just hired expensive lawyers, he had instructed them to submit heavily fabricated evidence. Included in the filing were falsified corporate ledgers, altered board meeting minutes, and sworn affidavits from Harrison. These documents were meticulously designed to make the $18 million look like legitimate, undeclared corporate revenue that Theodore had hidden without their knowledge. They were attempting to legitimize stolen money through the federal court system. It was a breathtakingly arrogant move, assuming that a federal judge would simply accept their forged documents without initiating a deeper forensic review. They were building a massive house of cards directly on top of a federal landmine. I needed to ensure they felt absolutely confident right up until the moment it detonated. To execute the final phase of my strategy, I needed legal representation. But I could not hire a high-powered, aggressive corporate defense attorney. If I walked into that courtroom with a shark, Richard and Harrison's legal team would immediately raise their defenses. They would scrutinize every move, anticipating a complex counterattack. I needed them to remain blinded by their own superiority complex. I needed a decoy. I spent 2 days researching local attorneys until I found exactly what I was looking for. Arthur Pendleton was a solo practitioner who operated out of a small, cramped office above a dry cleaner in a working-class neighborhood. He primarily handled minor civil disputes, property boundary issues, and low-level contract reviews. He was competent, honest, and entirely unremarkable. He wore slightly outdated suits and carried his documents in cardboard folders rather than leather briefcases. He was the absolute antithesis of Richard's elite legal team. I scheduled a consultation and brought the lawsuit filings to his office. Arthur reviewed the documents, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. He looked genuinely intimidated by the sheer volume of the filing and the reputation of the opposing firm. "Ethan, this is a massive federal lawsuit," Arthur said, his voice laced with concern. "The firm representing your father and brother, they are absolute sharks. They specialize in burying defendants in procedural motions and crushing them with legal fees. I am a small-town lawyer. I do not have the resources to fight a prolonged war of attrition against these people." "I am not asking you to fight a war, Arthur," I replied calmly. "I am asking you to facilitate a surrender." Arthur blinked, clearly confused. "A surrender? You want to hand the property over to them?" "I want you to handle the procedural filings," I explained. "I need you to represent me during the initial depositions and ensure all deadlines are met. You do not need to build an aggressive defense strategy. I simply need you to be my official counsel on record. I will handle the actual defense strategy myself. Your job is to keep the process moving forward without drawing any unnecessary attention." I slid a check for his retainer across the desk. It was a modest sum, completely appropriate for a lawyer of his standing. Arthur looked at the check, then back at me. He was hesitant, sensing that he was only seeing a fraction of the full picture. But the retainer was solid, and the instructions were clear. "All right, Ethan," Arthur agreed, tucking the check into a folder. "I will file the response and handle the communications with their firm. But you need to understand they are going to come at us with everything they have during the depositions. They are going to try to break you before we ever see a judge." "I am counting on it," I said. The dynamic was set. Richard and Harrison would look across the aisle and see a suspended auditor represented by a small-time, inexpensive lawyer. They would assume I was terrified, outgunned, and entirely incapable of mounting a serious defense. Their expensive lawyers would feel arrogant and overconfident, treating the case as a trivial formality. They would walk into the depositions completely unguarded, eager to secure their victory. And I was going to let them cement every single lie onto the official legal record. The deposition took place in a sprawling glass-walled conference room at Richard's elite law firm. It was a space designed entirely to intimidate. The table was polished mahogany stretching the length of the room. The view overlooked the Chicago skyline, a subtle reminder of the power dynamics at play. I arrived with Arthur, my modest attorney, who looked slightly pale as he set his cardboard folders down on the expensive wood. Across from us sat a phalanx of high-priced corporate litigators. They wore custom suits and looked at Arthur with barely concealed contempt. Richard and Harrison sat at the center of their legal team. They looked relaxed, exuding the arrogant confidence of men who believed they had already won. Sitting in the plush leather chairs at the back of the room were Patricia and Naomi. They had come as spectators, eager to watch the poor auditor be publicly dismantled. Throughout the entire proceeding, they smirked, checking their designer watches, and leaned in to whisper catty, insulting remarks to each other, making sure I could see their absolute disdain. The lead litigator for my family's firm was a man named Sterling. He had the aggressive, predatory posture of a seasoned corporate shark. He initiated the questioning with rapid-fire intensity, attempting to overwhelm me with legal jargon and aggressive posturing. "Ethan," Sterling began, leaning across the table and locking eyes with me. "Can you explain to this room how a suspended entry-level auditor miraculously discovered a hidden vault containing $18 million inside a condemned property in Gary, Indiana? A property you purchased for $36 immediately before discovering the cash. Are we expected to believe this was a remarkable coincidence or a highly orchestrated theft?" I shifted in my chair, allowing my shoulders to slump slightly. I broke eye contact with Sterling, looking down at my hands. I needed them to see exactly what they expected to see, a frightened, desperate man who was out of his depth. "I saw the auction listing." I answered, my voice intentionally quiet and slightly hesitant. "I thought it was a good investment opportunity. I was doing structural checks when I found the room. I did not know what was inside." Sterling pounced on my hesitation. He practically sneered. "You did not know what was inside, yet you immediately established a blind trust. You installed military-grade surveillance. You acted with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were stealing from their own family's corporate reserves." Arthur interjected, attempting to defend me. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness and making unfounded assertions." Sterling waved Arthur off dismissively, not even looking at him. "The facts are the facts, counselor. My clients Richard and Harrison have provided extensive documentation proving that this cash was a vital corporate asset temporarily stored by Theodore before his passing. Your client, acting with deceptive intent, exploited his background in auditing to locate and secure this property, effectively attempting to extort his own family." I let Sterling build his narrative. I answered his aggressive questions with short, non-committal responses. "I do not know. I cannot recall. I was just checking the drywall." Every hesitant answer I gave fueled their arrogance. Richard leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. Harrison chuckled under his breath, shaking his head at my apparent incompetence. In the back of the room, Naomi actually rolled her eyes, whispering something to Patricia that made them both laugh quietly. They thought they were breaking me. They thought their aggressive tactics were wearing down my resolve, preparing me to accept a pitiful settlement just to make the nightmare stop. They had no idea I was expertly managing the flow of the deposition. I was purposefully providing weak defensive answers to ensure that they felt compelled to aggressively assert their ownership of the money. I needed them to put their claims on the official legal record under oath, where they could never take them back. "Let us be absolutely clear for the record," Sterling stated, his voice booming in the quiet conference room. He turned to Richard and Harrison. "Are my clients explicitly stating under penalty of perjury that the $18 million in physical cash currently located within the Gary, Indiana property is the sole, exclusive, and undeclared property of your corporate entity, and that it was unlawfully withheld from the firm's operational liquid assets?" I held my breath. This was the moment. This was the entire point of the charade. If they hesitated now, if their lawyers cautioned them against claiming untaxed hidden cash, my entire strategy could collapse. But their greed and arrogance completely blinded them to the danger. They were so focused on crushing me and retrieving the money before the impending IRS audit that they abandoned all legal caution. Richard looked directly at the court reporter transcribing the deposition. "Yes," he stated firmly, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "That money belongs entirely to our firm. It is our corporate capital." Harrison nodded enthusiastically, eager to cement his claim to his salvation. "Absolutely. That is our cash reserve. It is our money, and Ethan is trying to steal it. I looked down at the table to hide the sudden cold smile that tugged at the corners of my mouth. The trap had just slammed shut. By the end of the 4-hour deposition, Richard and Harrison had legally officially sworn under penalty of perjury that the $18 million hidden in the wall was their money. They had provided fabricated ledgers claiming it as corporate revenue. They had emphatically demanded its immediate return to their firm's control. They had completely locked themselves into their own inescapable snare. They thought they had secured a brilliant legal victory against a pathetic, defenseless auditor. They had actually just handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped, legally binding confession to massive corporate embezzlement and federal tax evasion. The deposition concluded, and they walked out of the conference room looking like conquering heroes. That evening, the atmosphere in Chicago's most exclusive steakhouse was electric with premature victory. Richard and Harrison had reserved the private dining room at Gibson's, sparing no expense to celebrate their perceived triumph. The long mahogany table was covered in empty oyster shells, half-eaten dry-aged tomahawk steaks and crystal glasses gleaming under the ambient lighting. They had ordered 3 bottles of vintage Bordeaux, the kind that costs more than my monthly rent. Harrison was holding court at the head of the table, his face flushed with wine and arrogance. He regaled the table with an exaggerated recounting of the deposition, mimicking my hesitant, stammering answers. He described how my cheap public defender had barely said a word, and how Sterling's elite legal team had absolutely dismantled me. Richard laughed loudly, clapping his son on the back, praising his brilliant corporate maneuvering. They were entirely convinced that the federal judge would hand them a summary judgment in the morning, officially transferring the Gary property and the $18 million hidden inside back to the family empire. Naomi sat next to Harrison, looking radiant and completely untouchable. She wore a stunning emerald green cocktail dress and a new diamond necklace she had undoubtedly purchased on credit, assuming the massive cash infusion was guaranteed. She held up her phone, panning the camera across the table to capture the decadent feast and her husband's triumphant smile. She raised a glass of expensive champagne directly to the lens, her lips curving into a wicked smirk. She posted the video to her social media story with a highly public, undeniably arrogant caption, "Taking out the trash tomorrow." Patricia sat across from her, nodding in agreement, clearly relieved that the embarrassing stain on their family reputation was about to be permanently scrubbed clean. They toasted to their future, to their wealth, and to the complete destruction of the poor auditor who dared to challenge them. They were entirely consumed by their own delusion, completely unaware that their sworn testimony had just sealed their fate. A few miles away, my apartment was completely silent. The only illumination came from the soft blue light of my monitor and a single desk lamp. I did not order a steak, and I did not open a bottle of wine. I sat at my dining table, eating a simple meal of reheated pasta, my mind operating with absolute laser-focused precision. The heavy 500-page whistleblower report was completely finished. I hit the print command. The rhythmic hum of my laser printer filled the quiet apartment as page after page of devastating financial evidence slid into the output tray. I collected the warm paper, methodically organizing the documents into clear plastic sleeves. I placed the massive stack of evidence into a heavy black binder. Right next to it, I placed the small encrypted flash drive containing my grandfather Theodore's audio diaries and the master embezzlement ledger. I opened a separate browser tab, pulling up the official documentation for the United States Internal Revenue Code. I scrolled directly to Section 7623, Paragraph B, the IRS Whistleblower Reward Program. I read the legal phrasing, cementing the parameters in my mind. The law was absolute and unambiguous. If an individual provides specific, credible information regarding massive tax fraud or corporate embezzlement exceeding $2 million, and that information leads directly to the successful collection of the unpaid taxes and penalties, the whistleblower is legally entitled to a mandatory reward ranging from 15 to 30% of the collected proceeds. I looked at the black binder resting on my desk. The evidence inside was not just credible, it was absolute perfection. I had provided the federal government with a complete roadmap to a guaranteed conviction, bypassing months of forensic investigation. I had handed them the exact location of $18 million in physical untaxed cash. I had also handed them the sworn notarized perjury trap depositions of Richard and Harrison, claiming that exact cash as their own undeclared revenue. It was the most perfect, cleanly executed whistleblower package the IRS Criminal Investigation Division would ever receive. The contrast between the two scenes playing out across the city was stark. My family was loud, wasteful, and blindingly arrogant. They were celebrating a victory they had not earned, relying on brute financial force and intimidation to solve their problems. They believed their elite status made them completely immune to consequences. They operated under the assumption that the loudest voice in the room always wins. I was silent. I was meticulous. I was completely invisible. I did not rely on intimidation. I relied on raw, indisputable data. I understood that true power is not found in screaming threats across a courtroom or bragging on social media. True power is found in the quiet, methodical assembly of facts. I had spent my entire life being dismissed, insulted, and treated as completely irrelevant by the people currently celebrating my demise. They had stolen my future to fund their empire, and they had laughed while doing it. I closed the laptop and turned off the desk lamp. The apartment plunged into darkness. I stood up, picked up the heavy black binder, and placed it carefully into my battered leather briefcase. The same briefcase Naomi had mocked in the coffee shop just weeks ago. I checked my watch. The federal hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. I walked into my bedroom and set the alarm. I did not feel any anxiety or fear about the impending courtroom battle. I felt completely detached, operating entirely on muscle memory and professional training. The trap was perfectly constructed, fully loaded, and waiting to be triggered. My family thought they were walking into a coronation. They had no idea they were walking directly onto a federal scaffold. The poor auditor they had despised was about to execute the most devastating financial takedown they could possibly imagine. Checkmate. The alarm sounded at exactly 6 in the morning. I woke up completely rested, feeling the sharp mechanical clarity that always accompanied the final stages of a major corporate audit. I showered, shaved, and dressed in a simple, off-the-rack gray suit. It was clean and professional, but intentionally unremarkable. It was the uniform of an entry-level accountant, the exact visual representation my family expected to see. I picked up the heavy black binder containing the whistleblower report and my grandfather Theodore's encrypted flash drive, placing them securely inside my scuffed leather briefcase. Arthur met me on the wide concrete steps of the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse. The towering federal building loomed over the busy Chicago streets, a massive structure of glass and steel that perfectly matched the gravity of what was about to transpire. Arthur nervously adjusted his outdated striped tie, clutching his cardboard folders tight against his chest. He looked thoroughly intimidated by the federal jurisdiction, shifting his weight from foot to foot as commuters rushed past us. I simply nodded to him, keeping my expression entirely neutral, and we walked through the heavy security revolving doors. The contrast in our arrivals could not have been more striking. 10 minutes later, my family made their grand entrance. A fleet of 3 black chauffeured SUVs pulled up to the curb outside the courthouse. Richard, Patricia Harrison, and Naomi stepped out, moving with the coordinated arrogance of royalty arriving at a coronation. They were flanked by Sterling and a small army of junior corporate litigators. Richard wore a bespoke Italian suit that likely cost more than Arthur made in an entire year. Harrison sported a heavy gold Rolex that glinted under the harsh lobby lights, a bold display of the phantom wealth he was desperately trying to protect. Patricia and Naomi were draped in designer coats and carried luxury handbags projecting an image of absolute financial invincibility. They walked through the marble corridors of the federal courthouse as if they owned the building, completely unaware that they were marching directly toward their own financial execution. We converged in the wide, echo-heavy hallway just outside courtroom 24B. I stood near the heavy oak doors with Arthur, who was anxiously reviewing his procedural notes one last time. The family's legal entourage swept down the corridor, their expensive leather shoes clicking aggressively against the polished stone floor. Naomi led the charge. As she passed me, she abruptly veered to her left, executing a perfectly calculated aggressive shoulder bump that nearly knocked me off balance. She stopped abruptly, letting out an exaggerated gasp of mock horror. She reached up with a manicured hand and vigorously brushed off the shoulder of her designer jacket, acting as if my cheap gray suit had somehow contaminated her expensive fabric. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust, her eyes lingering mockingly on my battered leather briefcase. "Watch where you are walking, Ethan," Naomi said, her voice carrying loudly down the corridor to ensure her entire legal team heard the insult. "You should really try to preserve that cheap suit. You are going to need to return it to the discount rack when this is over. After the judge forces you to hand over the Gary property today, you will be completely bankrupt. You are not even going to be able to afford the bus ticket back to your pathetic little apartment. Maybe if you beg, Harrison will toss a quarter into your coffee cup on our way out." Harrison chuckled loudly, adjusting his gold watch with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. Richard smiled a tight, predatory smile, clearly relishing the sight of his youngest son being publicly humiliated by his daughter-in-law. Patricia did not even look at me. She simply checked her reflection in the glass of a nearby display case, completely indifferent to my existence. Arthur stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation, ready to defend me against the blatant harassment. I placed a firm hand on his arm, silently stopping him. I did not engage. I did not defend my suit or my finances. I looked directly into Naomi's eyes and delivered a slow, knowing smile. The absolute lack of fear in my expression caused her smug grin to falter for just a fraction of a second. She scoffed, turning on her designer heels, and followed her husband through the heavy wooden doors. They had just delivered their final insult, completely blind to the fact that I was already holding the match to their entire empire. We entered courtroom 24B. The space was intimidating, lined with dark wood paneling, and featuring a massive elevated bench for the federal magistrate. I took my seat at the defense table next to Arthur. We looked utterly outgunned. The plaintiff's table was crowded with Sterling and his team of corporate sharks, their mahogany desk covered in thick legal binders and polished laptops. Richard and Harrison sat directly behind their lawyers in the gallery's front row, leaning forward with eager anticipation. Naomi and Patricia sat next to them, whispering confidently and pointing occasionally toward our side of the room. A heavy silence fell over the room as the side door opened. The bailiff announced the arrival of the federal judge. Everyone in the room rose to their feet. The judge was a stern, no-nonsense federal magistrate with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding corporate deceit. He took his seat at the high bench, adjusted his reading glasses, and brought his heavy wooden gavel down with a sharp, resounding crack that echoed through the vast courtroom. "Please be seated," the judge commanded. He opened the thick case file on his desk, his eyes scanning the preliminary documents. "We are here for the preliminary hearing regarding the civil asset dispute filed by the plaintiffs against the defendant. Counsel, are we ready to proceed?" Sterling stood up immediately, buttoning his suit jacket. He projected an aura of supreme, absolute confidence. He shot a brief, pitying glance toward my table, looking at Arthur and me as if we were a minor annoyance he was about to swat away. The tension in the courtroom reached its absolute peak. My family leaned forward in their gallery seats, practically vibrating with excitement, ready to watch their high-priced lawyer completely crush the poor auditor. I rested my hand lightly on top of my battered leather briefcase. My heart rate was slow and steady. Sterling took a deep breath, stepped out from behind the plaintiff's table, and confidently approached the center podium, completely unaware that he was about to step directly onto a federal landmine. Donovan adjusted his posture at the center podium, projecting polished authority. He cleared his throat, launching an opening statement designed to steamroll over Warren and me. He spoke eloquently about corporate assets and the necessity of judicial intervention to recover stolen family funds, painting Richard and Harrison as victims of a rogue grandfather and a greedy son. Before Donovan could transition into his aggressive demand for an immediate summary judgment, the judge raised his hand. The sharp and sudden gesture brought the highly priced litigator to an absolute dead halt. The judge leaned forward over the heavy oak bench. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The magistrate had read the preliminary filings, and his expression was devoid of sympathy. He stated that the claims presented in the lawsuit were highly irregular, finding $18 million in physical currency hidden inside a foreclosed property bordered on the extraordinary. Therefore, he declared he would not rely solely on the rhetorical flourishing of legal counsel. He required direct sworn confirmation from the plaintiffs themselves before entertaining any asset transfer. The judge bypassed Donovan entirely and addressed Richard and Harrison, directly instructing them to stand. The sudden shift in protocol caught Donovan off guard, but he gestured for his clients to rise. Richard stood up first, proudly buttoning his tailored suit jacket with absolute entitlement. Harrison followed, mimicking his father's arrogant posture. They walked up to the plaintiff's table, looking at the judge with supreme confidence. They believed this was merely a procedural hoop to jump through before claiming their prize. The court clerk approached them, requesting they raise their right hands. Richard and Harrison complied without hesitation. They swore the standard oath, binding themselves to tell the whole truth under the severe penalty of federal perjury. The judge fixed his stern gaze upon them, his voice echoing loudly. He asked them to confirm the core assertion of their lawsuit. He required them to state unequivocally that the $18 million in physical cash, located at the specified property address in Gary, was the exclusive undeclared corporate revenue of their investment firm. The silence in the room was absolute. Donovan gave a slight nod of encouragement to his clients. Richard did not waver. He spoke with the commanding voice he used in corporate boardrooms. He stated clearly for the federal record that the money was entirely theirs. He claimed it was operational capital that Theodore had wrongfully concealed. Harrison, eager to cement his salvation, immediately backed his father up. He stated under oath that the funds were absolutely vital to their current corporate structure, and that they were the sole rightful owners of the undeclared cash hidden behind that drywall. The court reporter typed frantically, capturing every single word. The trap was now fully armed and locked. They had just legally claimed ownership of untaxed embezzled funds in front of a federal magistrate. The judge nodded slowly, making a final note before turning his attention across the room. His piercing gaze landed directly on me and my sweating lawyer. The judge asked Warren if the defense had prepared a response to this extraordinary claim. He asked if we intended to contest the plaintiff's sworn assertion that the money belonged to their corporate entity. The atmosphere in the gallery shifted instantly into quiet, vicious anticipation. I could feel the eyes of my family burning into the back of my head. Naomi leaned forward in her leather seat, a triumphant and cruel smirk stretching across her face. Patricia crossed her arms, looking at me with cold satisfaction. Richard and Harrison remained standing, looking down at me as if I were an insect they were about to crush. They fully expected me to put up a pathetic, desperate fight for the house. They anticipated that Warren would stutter through a weak legal defense. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the federal judge publicly reprimand me, strip away the deed to the property, and throw me out of the courtroom with absolutely nothing. They were ready for the glorious climax of their smear campaign. Warren nervously gathered his cardboard folders, preparing to stand up and deliver the standard procedural defense we had discussed. I reached out and clamped my right hand over Warren's forearm. The grip stopped him dead in his tracks. He looked at me, confusion flashing across his face. I shook my head once, a silent command to stay seated. The courtroom watched in breathless silence as I stood up from the defense table. I stood perfectly straight, squaring my shoulders and projecting an aura of absolute control. I slowly reached up and adjusted my tie, smoothing the fabric of my simple gray suit. I locked my eyes directly onto the federal magistrate, ignoring the glare of my father and brother. When I spoke, my voice rang out with chilling clarity, carrying easily to every corner of the large room. Your Honor, I stated clearly, measuring each word with the precise calculation of an auditor delivering a final report. I do not contest their claim. In fact, I completely agree that the $18 million belongs entirely to them. A profound, stunned silence slammed into the courtroom. The triumphant smirk instantly vanished from Naomi's face. Patricia uncrossed her arms, her posture stiffening in sudden alarm. Richard and Harrison exchanged a rapid, highly confused glance. Donovan actually took a step back from the podium, his brow furrowing as he tried to process this incredibly jarring deviation from his legal strategy. The narrative they had built completely evaporated in an instant. They were entirely bewildered. Why was the resentful, estranged son giving up his golden ticket without throwing a single punch? Why was he eagerly agreeing with their fabricated story? The sheer lack of resistance terrified them far more than any aggressive legal defense ever could. They had walked into a war zone, but the enemy was handing them the victory flag. They did not yet realize that the flag was attached to a grenade. The judge stared down at me from the high bench, his bushy eyebrows knitting together in deep, profound confusion. He had presided over federal civil asset disputes for decades, and defendants simply did not surrender $18 million without a brutal, protracted fight. Donovan, the lead litigator for my family, recovered quickly from his initial shock. He immediately seized what he believed was an unconditional surrender. He slapped his hands down on the polished mahogany plaintiff table, puffing out his chest, and demanded that the court immediately enter a summary judgment in favor of his clients. He requested an emergency injunction to grant Richard and Harrison immediate unrestricted access to the Gary property so they could retrieve their corporate funds before the close of business. I let Donovan finish his arrogant demand. I let the heavy silence hang in the courtroom for several seconds, ensuring every single person in the room was hanging on my next move. Then I reached down and popped the brass latches of my battered leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the quiet space. I reached inside and retrieved a thick, heavily bound document enclosed in a transparent, tamper-evident envelope. Stamped directly onto the front cover in dark, commanding ink was the official seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. I held the document up high so the judge, the opposing counsel, and my entire family sitting in the gallery could clearly see the federal emblem. I handed the sealed package to the bailiff, who promptly carried it up the steps to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the tense air of the courtroom. "While I absolutely concede that the physical cash belongs to my father and brother, I cannot facilitate the transfer of those assets today, or ever." Donovan scoffed loudly, adjusting his silk tie with a sneer of contempt. "You just conceded ownership, Ethan. You have no legal standing to withhold the funds. The court must compel you to hand over the keys to the property immediately." "I cannot hand over the keys, counselor," I replied, turning my head to look directly into my father's eyes, "because I no longer possess them." I took a slow, deliberate breath, shifting my posture from a defensive defendant to a licensed professional delivering a final audit report. However, as a licensed financial auditor, I continued projecting my voice so it reached the back row where my mother and sister-in-law were sitting. The moment I discovered $18 million in undeclared vacuum-sealed cash hidden inside a structural wall, I was legally obligated to report it. To do otherwise would be a severe violation of my fiduciary duty and a federal crime. I did not touch a single bill. I did not spend a single cent. Instead, I secured the perimeter, installed surveillance, and spent my unpaid suspension compiling a 500-page forensic accounting report. The smug confidence completely vanished from Donovan's face. He froze in place, his elite legal instincts suddenly screaming that he had just driven his clients directly into a fatal, inescapable ambush. 2 weeks ago, I announced, enunciating every syllable with chilling clarity, I turned the property, the security footage, and the comprehensive whistleblower report directly over to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The atmosphere in the courtroom shattered. It was a visceral, physical collapse of the entire reality my family had constructed. The color drained so rapidly from Harrison's face that his skin took on a sickly, translucent gray hue. His mouth opened wide, but his vocal cords completely seized. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. He realized in a fraction of a second that the midnight raid, the security cameras, the psychological warfare at the coffee shop, it had all been a carefully calculated distraction to keep them focused on me while the federal government quietly built an airtight criminal case. Richard, the untouchable patriarch of the family empire, physically crumbled. He gripped the heavy edge of the plaintiff table, his knuckles turning stark white as his knees buckled beneath him. He sank heavily into his leather chair, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a ragged, panicked wheeze. The immense gravity of his sworn testimony crashed down upon him. He had just spent an hour legally binding himself to the stolen money. He had provided forged ledgers to the court. He had brought a high-profile legal team into a federal building to demand the return of funds he had explicitly hidden from the federal government. In the gallery, Naomi dropped her designer handbag. It hit the wooden floor with a heavy thud, spilling her keys and expensive cosmetics. She pressed both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute unfiltered terror. She was a real estate broker who dealt in high-value contracts. She knew exactly what federal asset forfeiture meant for her lavish lifestyle and marital assets. Patricia simply sat frozen, her perfect posture rigid, completely incapable of processing the fact that her elite, flawless family was currently disintegrating in a public forum. Donovan, realizing the catastrophic career-ending magnitude of the perjury trap his clients had just sworn themselves into, began frantically whispering to his junior partners. He was desperately trying to figure out if he could retract their sworn statements. But the court reporter had already typed every single word. The judge was already breaking the seal on the Treasury document, his eyes scanning the official federal seizure notices with a grim expression. I stepped out from behind the defense table. I did not look at my lawyer. I did not look at the judge. I walked to the center aisle, standing directly between my father and my brother. I looked at the two men who had stolen my future, mocked my poverty, and tried to destroy my life to protect their bottomless greed. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Harrison. I said, my voice ringing with total uncompromising victory. Thank you for confirming under oath on the official federal record that this untaxed embezzled money is entirely yours. You just saved the federal prosecutors months of rigorous trial work. Harrison let out a choked, terrified sob. Richard stared blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his defeat. The federal agents waiting outside in the hallway, I concluded, turning my back on them and walking back to my seat, will be absolutely thrilled to hear it. I walked back to the defense table and stood beside Arthur. My footsteps echoed in the absolute breathless silence of the courtroom. The judge stared at me, his seasoned eyes analyzing the profound gravity of what I had just orchestrated. He looked at the sealed Treasury documents resting on his bench, then looked back at me. He demanded to know the exact nature of the evidence that prompted the federal involvement. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the small encrypted flash drive. The black casing caught the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom. I stepped forward and placed it deliberately on the polished wood of the judge's bench. I slid my grandfather Theodore's flash drive directly across the heavy mahogany table to the judge. It stopped right next to his gavel. My grandfather left this drive detailing decades of your tax evasion and fraud, I said, turning my head to look squarely at Richard and Harrison. He tracked every stolen dollar, every offshore shell company, and every falsified corporate ledger. He left me a note inside that vault that said checkmate. He wanted me to use this to destroy you, but he did not beat you today. I did not beat you today. Your own unparalleled greed did. The judge picked up the flash drive. He looked at Donovan, the high-priced corporate litigator who was currently sweating through his custom silk shirt. Donovan raised his hands and took a massive step away from Richard and Harrison, silently communicating to the court that he had no prior knowledge of this staggering criminal conspiracy. Before the judge could utter another word, the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a violent booming crash. The sound made every single person in the gallery jump. A dozen men and women strode into the room. They were not wearing designer suits. They wore dark, tactical windbreakers with stark yellow lettering printed across their backs. IRS, and FBI. The federal agents moved with terrifying synchronized precision. They bypassed the wooden gate separating the gallery from the litigation tables, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet. The metallic clink of handcuffs hanging from their tactical belts provided a chilling soundtrack to their approach. The lead federal agent, A tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely stoic expression walked straight up to the judge's bench. He flashed a golden badge and handed over a thick stack of federal arrest warrants and asset seizure authorizations. The judge reviewed the top page, gave a curt nod of approval, and gestured toward the plaintiff table. The coordinated sting operation was flawlessly executed. The agents surrounded Richard and Harrison, physically blocking any possible avenue of escape. Richard and Harrison, the lead agent announced, his voice carrying the absolute authority of the United States government. You are under arrest for federal tax evasion, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate embezzlement, and perjury. Place your hands behind your backs immediately. Utter, unmitigated chaos erupted inside the federal courtroom. The carefully maintained facade of elite, untouchable wealth instantly dissolved into a pathetic display of primal panic. Harrison completely shattered. The arrogant investment director who had mocked my cheap briefcase and threatened me in coffee shops let out a high-pitched, guttural wail. He collapsed to his knees right there on the courtroom floor. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his expensive skin cream. He threw his hands up in the air, frantically begging the federal agents and the judge for mercy. He sobbed uncontrollably, screaming that he was just following orders, that it was all his father's idea, desperately trying to throw Richard under the bus to save his own skin. The agents ignored his pathetic crying, roughly grabbing his arms and snapping the heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. Richard reacted with a completely different brand of desperation. The patriarch of the family empire wildly attempted to backtrack his own sworn testimony. He slammed his hands against the table, screaming at the judge that he had lied. He frantically yelled that the $18 million was not his, that he had never seen the money, and that he had committed perjury just to win the civil lawsuit. It was a fatal, catastrophic legal error. In his blind panic to escape the tax fraud charges, he was loudly confessing to a separate federal felony on the official court record. The judge watched him with absolute disgust. Two agents grabbed Richard, twisting his arms behind his back and cuffing him as he continued to scream nonsensical, contradictory denials. In the gallery, Naomi realized with horrifying clarity that her lavish high society lifestyle was completely over. The federal asset freeze under the RICO Act meant every mansion, every luxury car, and every bank account attached to her marriage was instantly gone. Survival instinct kicked in, overriding any sense of loyalty. She frantically pulled her smartphone out of her designer handbag with shaking fingers. She dialed her personal attorney, screeching into the receiver at the top of her lungs. She demanded that he initiate an emergency divorce filing, immediately screaming that she needed to sever all legal ties to Harrison and protect her personal real estate assets before the federal government seized everything she owned. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing off the high ceiling of the courtroom as she paced back and forth in a blind panic. Patricia sat completely paralyzed in the front row of the gallery. The shock of watching her wealthy, powerful husband and her golden child son being hauled away in handcuffs had induced a catatonic state. Her eyes were wide and vacant, staring blankly at the polished wooden floor. She could not comprehend how their elite, untouchable family had been utterly dismantled in a matter of minutes. I stood calmly at the defense table, watching the federal agents march Richard and Harrison down the center aisle. Harrison was still weeping loudly, dragging his feet completely broken. Richard kept his head down, the reality of decades in federal prison finally settling into his mind. They walked right past me. Neither of them looked up. They were entirely destroyed. The courtroom, once a stage for their arrogant posturing, had become the site of their ultimate ruin. I adjusted my simple gray suit, picked up my battered leather briefcase, and turned to Arthur, who was staring at the scene in absolute awe. I had told him we were not fighting a war but facilitating a surrender. He finally understood exactly what I meant. The trap had worked perfectly, and the auditor's ledger was finally balanced. I took a deep breath of the air inside the courtroom, feeling a profound sense of closure. The heavy burden of their endless expectations, their relentless cruelty, and their insatiable greed had completely evaporated. They had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was a failure, a man with zero vision who would never amount to anything. Yet here I was, standing tall and free, while they were being escorted out the door in shackles. Donovan, their highly paid corporate litigator, hastily packed his expensive leather bags. He did not look at Naomi or Patricia. He simply rushed out of the side doors, eager to distance himself from the toxic fallout of a federal criminal investigation. His massive legal fees would likely remain unpaid, another casualty of the family's total financial collapse. The judge banged his gavel one final time, officially dismissing the civil lawsuit with prejudice and formally remanding the evidence to the federal authorities. The echo of the gavel was the final punctuation mark on my family's legacy. I turned around and walked down the center aisle, stepping out into the bright, sunlit corridor of the courthouse, leaving the utter chaos and destruction entirely behind me. Naomi stood in the gallery, her manicured fingers gripping her phone with enough force to turn her knuckles stark white. She was screaming at her private wealth manager, demanding an immediate total liquidation of all her marital assets and an emergency wire transfer to an offshore holding account. She was a high-end real estate broker who understood exactly how quickly federal asset forfeiture could annihilate a luxury portfolio. She thought her speed and elite connections could outrun the government. A female federal agent detached herself from the main arrest unit and walked directly up the center aisle toward Naomi. The agent did not raise her voice. She did not draw a weapon. She simply reached out and firmly pressed her hand down on Naomi's phone, lowering it from her ear. The agent looked Naomi dead in the eye and delivered the fatal blow to her elite existence. She informed Naomi that attempting to move capital was completely useless. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, federal warrants had been executed across the entire banking network. Every single corporate account, personal checking account, investment portfolio, and real estate holding attached to her marriage had been frozen. There were no hidden funds left. There were no emergency offshore wires. The luxury vehicles, the suburban mansion, the designer wardrobes, everything was now effectively property of the United States government, pending a massive criminal investigation. The phone slipped from Naomi's trembling fingers and clattered against the wooden floorboards. The fierce, untouchable arrogance that had defined her entire personality vanished. Her knees gave out, and she slumped back into the hard wooden gallery bench, her mouth open in a silent scream of absolute financial terror. She was left with nothing but the expensive dress on her back. Beside her, my mother, Patricia, finally broke. The catatonic shock wore off, replaced by raw, visceral devastation. She collapsed forward into the seat in front of her, burying her face in her arms and wailing. It was a loud, ugly, agonizing sound that echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings of the federal courtroom. She watched through streaming tears as the federal agents firmly grabbed her husband and her golden child's son, twisting their arms behind their backs. The metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Richard's and Harrison's wrists was the loudest sound in the room. It was the definitive sound of an empire falling. Richard's shoulders sagged, the fight completely drained from his body. The imposing, ruthless patriarch was reduced to a frightened, broken old man in a tailored suit. Harrison was still weeping, his chest heaving with violent sobs as an agent forcibly marched him down the center aisle. He looked at me as he passed by the defense table, his eyes silently begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. I watched them walk out the heavy wooden doors flanked by federal agents, their freedom gone forever. I picked up my scuffed leather briefcase from the defense table. My unassuming attorney was still staring at the empty doorway in a state of profound shock. I thanked him for his procedural assistance, shook his hand, and walked out of the courtroom. No federal agent stopped me. No one asked me any questions. I walked straight past the security checkpoint, pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, and stepped out into the bright, crisp Chicago afternoon. I was completely untouched. I had not just defeated my family, I had engineered a flawless, highly lucrative financial maneuver. The strategy relied entirely on a specific powerful piece of federal legislation known as the IRS Whistleblower Reward Program. It was a law designed for auditors and financial insiders who possessed irrefutable proof of massive corporate fraud. The parameters of the law were exceptionally clear. If an individual reported a case of tax evasion or corporate embezzlement that exceeded $2 million, and if that individual provided the exact actionable evidence required to secure a federal conviction and the recovery of those funds, the whistleblower was legally entitled to a mandatory percentage of the recovered assets. By meticulously assembling a 500-page forensic accounting report complete with my grandfather's audio confessions, the exact location of the physical cash, and the sworn perjury trap depositions from Richard and Harrison, I had handed the federal government an absolute slam dunk case. The government did not need to spend years investigating. I had done the work for them. Because the evidence I provided was so complete and led directly to the immediate seizure of the hidden $18 million, the law guaranteed me the maximum possible payout. I was legally entitled to 30% of the recovered funds. The bureaucratic machinery of the federal government moves slowly, but it moves with absolute certainty. I returned to my quiet apartment and resumed my life free from the toxic weight of my family's expectations. I simply waited. Months later, the official notification arrived via a secure encrypted email from the Department of the Treasury. The criminal convictions against Richard and Harrison had been finalized. The asset forfeiture was complete. The whistleblower claim had been thoroughly reviewed, audited, and officially approved by the highest levels of the Internal Revenue Service. The next morning, I logged into my personal banking portal. I watched the screen load my auditor's mind, appreciating the beautiful simplicity of the numbers. There was an incoming wire transfer directly from the United States government. The transaction description was completely barren, containing only a series of routing codes and federal authorization numbers. The amount deposited into my account was exactly $5,400,000. I stared at the screen, a deep, resonant sense of peace washing over me. This was not dirty money. It was not stolen corporate capital or embezzled retirement funds. It was an official, perfectly legal, heavily audited reward from the federal government. 2 years passed since the day the wire transfer cleared my account. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. I sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse one last time to witness the final chapter of my family's legacy. The sentencing hearing was completely devoid of the arrogant bluster they had displayed during the civil dispute. Richard and Harrison stood before the federal judge wearing standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuits. Their tailored Italian suits, silk ties, and heavy gold watches were long gone, replaced by cheap canvas slip-on shoes and canvas uniforms. The judge showed absolutely zero leniency for white-collar criminals who destroyed the retirement funds of innocent employees. He brought his heavy wooden gavel down, sentencing both my father and my older brother to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Harrison wept openly at the defense table, his shoulders shaking as the marshals escorted him away. Richard stared blankly at the floorboards, a completely broken man who had gambled his entire empire and lost everything. The collateral damage extended far beyond the prison walls. Naomi faced the absolute destruction of the elite lifestyle she worshipped. The federal government seized every luxury vehicle, every piece of designer jewelry, and every high-end property she had acquired using embezzled funds. Furthermore, the State Real Estate Commission permanently revoked her broker license due to her proximity to the massive financial fraud. The woman who once sneered at my cheap briefcase and mocked my apartment was now entirely bankrupt. To survive, Naomi was forced to take a minimum wage job at a discount retail store in a strip mall. She now spends her days wearing a stiff, uncomfortable polyester uniform, folding cheap sweaters, and enduring the complaints of rude customers. She is completely invisible to the wealthy elites she once considered her peers, trapped in the exact kind of working-class life she used to mock with such vicious cruelty. My mother, Patricia, fared no better. Stripped of her immense wealth and her towering social status, she was immediately excommunicated from her high society circles. The country club canceled her membership. Her wealthy friends permanently blocked her phone number, treating her name like a contagious disease. She was forced to vacate her sprawling suburban mansion and move into a cramped, poorly lit studio apartment on the very edge of the city limits. There are no more catered anniversary galas or Michelin star dinners. She spends her evenings alone in a tiny room with peeling paint and cheap secondhand furniture heating up frozen microwave meals. She is completely isolated, mourning the total loss of her status far more deeply than she mourns the loss of her husband or her son. She built her entire identity on looking down at others, and now she resides firmly at the bottom. With their fates permanently sealed, I had one final task to complete. I drove my truck back to Gary, Indiana on a crisp, clear Tuesday morning. I parked on the cracked pavement across from the rotting $36 house. I did not come to renovate the property. I did not come to flip it for a small profit. I came to erase it. Idling heavily in the street next to me was a massive yellow industrial excavator I had hired for the morning. The heavy machinery operator looked down at me from his elevated cab, waiting for my signal. I stood on the broken sidewalk, looking at the sagging roof and the shattered windows. This house represented the darkest, most toxic elements of my family's greed. It was the physical manifestation of their betrayal, the literal vault where they had tried to bury my grandfather's legacy and my own future. I raised my hand and gave the operator a single firm nod. The massive diesel engine roared to life, sending a plume of dark exhaust into the chilly air. The heavy steel tracks ground against the pavement as the machine lurched forward. The operator swung the enormous mechanical arm upward, positioning the heavy steel claw directly over the front porch. With a deafening crash, the claw smashed downward effortlessly, biting through the rotting wood and brittle shingles. The sound of destruction was incredibly cathartic. I watched as the walls caved in, sending thick clouds of white plaster dust rolling across the overgrown lawn. The machine tore into the false partition I had breached months ago. The heavy lead-lined panic room that once held $18 million was ripped from the foundation, crushed into jagged pieces of scrap metal, and tossed into a waiting dumpster truck. I stood there for 2 hours, watching the operator systematically grind the entire toxic history of that property into dust. I was wiping the slate completely clean. When the heavy machinery finally powered down and rolled away, the dust slowly settled. I walked forward onto the newly cleared, completely empty dirt lot. The rotting wood, the moldy drywall, and the hidden vault were entirely gone. The sun broke through the morning clouds, shining brightly over the leveled ground. I took a deep, steadying breath of the fresh, cold air. I am 33 years old. I have absolutely no stress, zero debt, and a staggering net worth securely managed in legitimate, diversified portfolios. My professional reputation is completely bulletproof, elevated to legendary status within the financial auditing community. I did not win by playing dirty. I did not resort to illegal tactics, physical threats, or underhanded manipulation. I won by playing strictly by the rules. I used my family's staggering arrogance, their blatant criminality, and their bottomless greed as the ultimate weapons against them. Some people think they can use money and power to crush the truth, but sometimes all it takes is $36 a sledgehammer and the patience to watch them dig their own graves. Have you ever watched a toxic person fall into a trap of their own making? Tell me your story in the comments. The story of the $36 foreclosed house and the hidden $18 million vault offers a profound lesson on the nature of true vindication. Real power does not roar. It observes, calculates, and waits. Throughout the narrative, the protagonist's family relies entirely on the superficial weight of their wealth, their elite social status, and their loud, aggressive intimidation tactics to crush him. They operate under the toxic assumption that whoever screams the loudest and spends the most money controls reality. However, Ethan's ultimate triumph demonstrates a powerful truth: unwavering integrity and cold, methodical logic will always outmaneuver arrogant corruption. When faced with intense emotional abuse and deep familial betrayal, The natural human instinct is to react impulsively, to scream back, to seek immediate revenge, or to compromise one's own moral compass just to level the playing field. Ethan defies this expectation completely. By stepping back and viewing his family's cruelty through the detached, analytical lens of a professional auditor, he absolutely refuses to give them the emotional reaction they so desperately crave. Instead, he uses their greatest weakness, their blinding greed and unshakable superiority complex, as the precise instrument of their destruction. He never breaks the law or lowers himself to their level of deceit. He simply fortifies his own position, follows the federal rules, and allows their monumental hubris to lead them directly into a perjury trap of their own making. This narrative powerfully reminds us that we do not need to fight toxicity with more toxicity. When dealing with manipulative individuals who constantly try to erase your worth, the most devastating response is not a screaming match, but absolute quiet success, built on an unshakable foundation of truth. You preserve your own peace by letting the corrupt dig their own graves. If you are currently facing toxic individuals in your own life, step back from the emotional chaos. Protect your peace and start building your own undeniable success today.